Marco Rubio is set to deliver a foreign policy speech later today, focusing on how he would challenge the Chinese government. And the senator joins us now with more. He's currently tied in 7th place with 4% support in the latest poll by the Public Policy polling out of New Hampshire. I don't know about these polls, Senator. When you got 16 people or whatever it is, you divide them up, and everybody's going to be in single digits until things start playing themselves out, as they obviously eventually will. So I don't know if it means anything to cite that. But you're going to talk China, and China's been on our lips for the past 2-3 weeks and longer, obviously. But with this market break, a lot of it had to do with the contagion, or at least China catching a cold, and we started sneezing.
Yeah, so first of all, we plan to give the speech even before this happened this week. The relationship between the United States and China will probably be the defining one of the 21st century. They're now the 2nd largest economy, and you're seeing the impact they can have globally. The United States is somewhat insulated from what happens in China to a degree, but emerging markets around and developing markets are not. And obviously, those are export markets for us, trading partners that has an impact on our economy ultimately. And the other challenge with China with regards to economics is they're not very transparent. I mean, when we see their numbers, we don't know how real they are. So I think one of the things you saw early this week and into the past week when they began to tinker with their currency and some of the other measures they've taken is perhaps a sense that the Chinese did not have control of what was happening, that they didn't have full control and an ability to deal with whatever internal challenges they're facing economically. And because it's not an open society, its governments don't really open up their books the way most developed economies around the world do. I think that leads to some of the panic as well. But this is an important, we were going to give this speech anyway, because this relationship between the U.S. and China will in many respects define what the 21st century is going to look like.
And it's a, you know, if there was ever, if you look up frenemy, I don't know, I probably put it in the Oxford English Dictionary at this point, it's been used so much, but it really exactly describes what we are with China. It's so essential that we maintain good relationships in terms of trade, because it's the market we need to sell into, 1.4 billion people, and yet we've got, you know, they steal our technology. They own us with, you know, they need to keep buying our treasuries, or yields could spike here to where we can barely sustain our debt. So, I mean, it's to just make hyperbolic statements about, you know, cutting off ties or protectionist statements, that doesn't work any better than rolling over for the Chinese.
Well, we shouldn't be doing anything that's counterproductive, like starting a currency war. It would hurt Americans. It's like increasing taxes on Americans. But we also can't fall into this trap of believing that engagement alone and more trade is going to lead to a change in behavior. At the end of the day, China is governed by an autocratic communist regime, very closed off, and they're strategic competitors at a minimum, without a doubt. And in the case of their military posture in the Asia-Pacific region, they are increasingly a strategic competitor and potentially adversary. They have taken a very aggressive position, for example, in the South China Sea, and it's one we shouldn't accept. And that's why I believe we need to not just increase defense spending, but our posture in that region and strengthen our ties. And on the economic front, I think now more than ever, this week is a case for why we need to finally conclude this free trade agreement with our allies in the Asia-Pacific region. These are developed economies, and if we could foster free trade, it won't be an exclusionary deal, but in order for China to join it, they will have to change their policies, their restrictions on imports, the way they manipulate prices and subsidize exports, their currency manipulation, the way they steal intellectual property and secrets from our companies. They won't be able to join that bloc, which at this point, if it can conclude it, will be the most powerful trading bloc in the world unless they change behavior. It's a very clear incentive for them to do so, although it's hard for them to do it because of the nature of that regime.
Whether it was Bush fatigue, the Iraq War, whatever caused us to decide that we can't somehow export our values or our democracies to other places, it's resulted in making the idea that we would demand something in terms of human rights from someone that's very unfashionable right now. We would never ask Cuba to do anything with dissidents as a prerequisite for opening relations. With Iran, we'd never ask them to stop supporting terrorists around the globe to get a deal done. And I can't imagine are you saying with China we should ask them to be more like us in terms of an open and fair society? I mean, other places aren't like us, Senator.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, not only should we continue to ask and insist on that, but we should be supportive of the people within China that are trying to make that happen. And, for example, I've said that if elected president, I will invite dissidents from all over the world to attend my inauguration. And I think it's unfortunately been a strategic mistake on the part of this administration to kind of give lip service to human rights, but really put it to the side in the interest of increasing dialogue with China, for example. But look around the world today. Every source of instability on this planet is created by a tyranny. It's the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, radical Islamists, and Iran. What do all five of them have in common? They are all tyrannies. None of them are democracies, obviously, or believe in, and they're all serial violators of human rights. I mean, in Moscow, if you oppose Putin, you wind up poisoned or dead. In China, with well-documented human rights abuses. North Korea is horrifying. And what happens there, we all know about ISIS, we all know about Iran. So all of the instability in the world, all the violent instability in the world comes from tyrannies. And that alone should be an indicator of why we should continue to push for human rights.
You're calling Chinese government tyrants?
Absolutely. It is not a democracy. It isn't. There is, for example, they have a great firewall, they call it, in the internet, where they literally block off the ability of their own people to access a free flow of information from around the world. They tell churches who their leaders are. You have to have state-sanctioned churches. They tell the Catholic Church who their cardinal is. They don't even let churches appoint their own leadership. We've, in fact, have seen an increase in repression over the last couple of years because part of the problem they have is this model they've been following over the last 20 years has run its course. It doesn't work anymore.
Senator,
and as a result, they're cracking down even harder on their own people.
You know, when you talk about, though, the Chinese economy and the relationship the United States has with China, when you call them a tyranny like that, how would you go about creating a better relationship, or would you at all?
Well, of course we want a better relationship, but not at the expense of our principles. Ultimately, I do think we can't ignore them. They're the second largest economy in the world. They have an increasingly powerful military. They're geopolitically important in different spheres. And I think we've got to be able to continue to engage with them on these fronts. You can't ignore their geopolitical importance. But that doesn't mean you silence yourself on human rights issues. Right. It doesn't mean you look the other way on the things they do to their own people. Because quite frankly, if they grow more powerful, they're going to export, for lack of a better term, their values. And their values are not the kind of world that I want to live in. I mean, if the 20th century was the American century, if the 21st century becomes the Chinese century, what does that look like around the world? What does it look like if the most powerful country in the world is someone who does what they do to their own people? That's not the kind of world I want my children to inherit. And I don't think that's going to be good for trade or commerce either, by the way.
Let me just ask you a quick question about negotiating. We were talking about this in the 6 o'clock hour. Donald Trump has said repeatedly he'd like Carl Icahn to be his Treasury Secretary, calling him a great negotiator, telling us or the public that he would put Carl Icahn in charge of the relationship with China. What do you make of that?
Well, obviously, you know, Carl Icahn is a very intelligent person. I'm sure he could do a good job, and others as well. You know, negotiating a geopolitical arrangement is very different than a business deal. There are all sorts of other considerations in play. It's not just about profits for countries. I mean, for China's perspective, they believe that their rightful place in the world is to be the most powerful nation on the planet. That's the way it's been historically, and that the last 100 years is an aberration. And they're perfectly willing to bide their time and to achieve it. Their first goal is to drive us out of the Asia-Pacific region. In essence, a Chinese Monroe Doctrine for Asia. And we need to recognize that in any negotiations. And so, for example, part of the considerations cannot be concessions that abandon allies like Japan or South Korea or the Philippines or even the Australians and others who feel deeply threatened by what China's doing today in the South China Sea with navigational rights, with airspace, et cetera.
Senator, obviously, there's a mix of foreign policy objectives and domestic objectives that any candidate needs to, have plans for. Let's just switch quickly to economics. We did have a GDP revision to 3.7, total fluke in the past 6 years, and obviously not sustainable. But it's a heck of a number, and it's a nice one to shoot for. And we've got a whole, maybe half of the political spectrum in this country at this point thinks we can only do 2%, and that's good enough if we're going to provide, I guess, a social safety net or an egalitarian society. 2% is going to be fine. Do you have a way to get out of the doldrums that really have caused 70% of the country to feel like we're in the wrong direction?
Yeah, and part of it is recognizing that we're not dealing with a cyclical economic downturn that we're trying to climb out of. This is a massive economic restructuring. This is a massive shift in the very nature of the economy.
Right.
It's akin to the Industrial Revolution, except it's happening faster than the Industrial Revolution. And we need policies that recognize that. We need policies that allow us to be globally competitive. We need policies that allow us to lead on innovation. That's why I'm for tax reform and regulatory reform. We now have to compete with dozens of other markets and economies. We also have to revolutionize what we mean by higher education. The 21st century new economy is going to produce better paying jobs than the 20th century economy, but those new jobs will require additional skills that perhaps weren't required in the past. And we do not have a higher education system that delivers those skills or that is affordable for the people who need it the most.
Senator,
so we need more vocational training. And
question just for you,
yes,
which is you're being substantive and being thoughtful on these issues on this program that we're having this conversation about, and yet in this terrible circus that is politics, it seems so hard to get out from under the shadow that is the Donald. How do you do that?
Well, you keep doing, first of all, I'm going to be true to myself. This is a campaign where I'm going to tell people who I am and what I'm about. I think this country recognizes we are at an important moment. I tell people this election is truly a generational choice about our identity in the 21st century. And I honestly believe that if we embrace the new economy, we're going to have to confront its challenges because these changes are disruptive, but also embrace its opportunities. I think the 21st century is going to be more prosperous than the 20th century, and it can be another American century. I'm going to continue with that message consistently. And I think as we get closer to voting day in these early states, voters will begin to focus in on the election beyond the entertainment value of it. And I think they will appreciate these arguments. But no one's taken the time over the last 10 years to explain to people that what we are facing in this country is a massive economic global restructuring that actually plays to our benefit. There's no country in the world I would trade places with. We're the most innovative people on the planet, the most productive workers.
Hey,
we're
Senator,
blessed with oil and natural gas.
Still got to get.
So we're in really good shape if we do what we need to do.
To govern, you got to get elected. I think Hillary Clinton on women's issues. I'm not sure you were thrown under the bus. I think maybe you were, but certain Republicans are as bad as terrorists in terms of women's issues, and I'm talking about maybe some comments on abortion, right to life, choice, things like that. And you know, when you've got rhetoric like that from the other side, that's going to come up in a general election, and you need to cobble together 50%.
Yeah, but she has zero credibility, and it's eroding by the day. She's a desperate candidate who obviously has been badly hurt by the revelations of the deceitfulness that occurred with the emails and the server that she had. And quite frankly, it's not just the lying about it. It is the fact that that was highly sensitive, classified information that was irresponsibly handled. Someone violated the law, and we don't know who it is. It could have been her. We'll see what the investigation shows. So they're in desperation mode. She's going to use some of this over-the-top rhetoric. And again, I mean, that's just part of every election cycle, unfortunately. Right. But we're going to focus on what matters, and I think people see exactly what's happening here, and that is a desperate campaign who now sees potentially a challenge from Joe Biden, and they're trying to change the subject. But the subject won't change. The bottom line is that we're going to focus on our agenda for America. And every single day, it's being further exposed how irresponsible she was on how she handled very critical information that was sensitive for our country.
All right. Thanks, Senator. And next time, stop by next time you're in New York, as you do most of the time, and we look forward to seeing you.